Thank you so much, Rania, for the welcome and introduction. And thanks to all the participants, many of whom have been here throughout a long day. Of course, in the US, I'm in Chicago, and it's still like morning over here. So I'd like to give kind of a broad take that is geared to educators and educators in various contexts on Sufi perspectives on peace. And I'd like to maybe make you aware both of some of the prospects and challenges of the Sufi tradition for peace education in various contexts. So what is Sufism? I think this audience has a pretty good idea. Sometimes Islamic mysticism, part of classical Islamic thought, along with theology and law. But there are many dimensions to Sufism, both, that's sort of embedded in the classical Islamic tradition, high tradition Sufism, textual, mystical teachings. And then, of course, there's popular Sufism in many cultures of the Muslim world. There are practices such as visiting the shrines of departed Sufi saints, healing. And in the West, there is, I know Julian just presented on, if you will, a global Sufi order that is grounded in Islamic Sufi principles. And along with that, we also have universalistic New Age Sufism. And an important element of Sufism that resonates with the purpose of education and with strategies for pedagogy is its role and practices of moral training and cultivation of the person. Sometimes that's known as tarbiyah. So the themes of my presentation today, first of all, I'm going to make a case for Sufism as part of peace education. I'm going to then maybe make you aware of some resources or give you some ideas about how to develop resources for peace education out of the Sufi tradition. I'm going to say something about potential for curricular integration of Sufi materials, some of the challenges, prospects, and resources. And I'm well aware, having worked with Ednan and with some of you on projects in the field of religious education, that there are very different contexts, whether you're in Western Europe, the United States, or in a traditional Muslim society. So let's make the case. I mean, here we're preaching to the choir, but generally the need for Islamic content within peace education or peace studies. Well, in the West, for example, Islam is just not the well known. As we learned from Juan's presentation, there are many elements of peaceful resources within the Islamic tradition that are just not well known. And a lot of that is because of deliberate misinformation about Islam, stereotypes or exclusive emphasis on violent elements. And in fact, Muslims themselves may not be aware of the peaceful interpretations that exist in the sacred text or that have been made throughout history by classical figures and are being made today. There are stereotypes about Sufism, both in the West and within Muslim societies. One is that Sufism is somehow non-Islamic, comes from outside of Islam. The other is, this goes back to colonial times, that Sufis were free thinkers who rejected Islamic law, and therefore that's very threatening to many Muslims. Or that Sufis are not involved in the world, that they're navel gazers, that they don't seek to transform society or, work again. And all of those are incorrect. So first, let me say something about challenges to incorporating Sufism as part of Islamic religious education. And this, of course, would be in the context of Islamic schools that are increasingly present, for example, in the United States and in some European countries. So some contemporary Muslims reject Sufism for some of the reasons that I mentioned before. So a solution to that, kind of pushback, no, we don't want Sufi material in our curriculum, is to frame it within Quranic terms, or what is acceptable, or really an essential part of Islamic teachings. And so we heard in Julian's presentation about this idea of ihsan, which is one of the three important components, along with Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. So the ritual practices, the doctrines of the faith, and then a kind of behavior or attitude of doing things beautifully. There's also a term for doing the inner work, tazkiyat nafs, the purification of the soul. It's also possible to draw on poetry and writings that may not be so controversial in terms of imparting Sufi teachings, especially Al-Ghazali, a figure who died in 1111, a classical Islamic thinker, and of course, Rumi in many Islamic contexts is also, one of ours, and not marginalized as being too Sufi. Now, what about public schools? And of course, I'm thinking of my own context here in the United States. Often religion is not taught at all. So then Sufi ideas could be imparted within the curriculum in as part of cultural studies or global studies. In the case of Europe, many of the European countries have alternatives to explicitly Islamic religious education by having classes in global ethics or global religions. So Sufi materials could easily be part of that. Now, in Islamic religious education, often when something about Sufism is presented, it's simply history, right? Or rather than making use of core teachings about moral edification or things that could overlap or reinforce peace studies. Now, within the Muslim world, so I know we have some participants here from Turkey, or and potentially any other Arab societies, Iran, whatever. Some of the challenges to incorporating Sufi materials might be, take the case of Saudi Arabia, that something explicitly Sufi might not be acceptable. Otherwise, again, there's a problem, a challenge, that if Sufism is mentioned, it's either simply presented as something historical or even as sectarianism. So listing the different Sufi orders, for example, in the Turkish curriculum, rather than really going into the teachings of Sufism. There's also another challenge, that Sufism may be selected, pointed out as being the good, peaceful aspect of Islam. So you get that, for example, in the United States post 9/11. Some of you may have heard of the famous RAND report, so sort of right-wing think tanks saying in terms of American foreign policy that Sufis should be supported and patronized because they are the peaceful, moderate interpretation of Islam. So of course that tends to make Sufis even more marginalized, or perhaps co-opted as part of that. But even in traditional Muslim minority countries, Morocco, Pakistan, one has this promotion of Sufism. If we found a Sufi council or have some conferences, that would be the peaceful face of Islam. So I have some examples here from other presentations I've done. So sort of this idea of, this is the leader of a Sufi movement in the United States, Naqshbandi Haqqani, and with different political leaders right around that time, like post 9/11. Some of you may be familiar with the Pakistani figure, Tahir al-Qadri, and his sort of shift from Sufism to de-radicalization occurring. And then the previous leader of Pakistan, Parvez Musharraf, who had established right around that time Sufi councils, and this idea that promoting Sufism works against extremism, right? So this, again, a Pakistani conference, we want to promote Sufi music and teachings because this will counter. And then the World Sufi Forum, that was actually sponsored by Narendra Modi. So this, again, Sufism, on the one hand, is positive, but yet being instrumentalized for political views. So that's a challenge. Like, how is Sufism being integrated in broader cultural movements, and then in education, and then explicitly in peace education? So now I'm shifting to the theme of Sufi inspired resources for peace education. And we've heard in some of the previous presentations about doing the inward work. So in Sufism, there is a strong tradition of psychology, reflecting on one's behavior, taking stock, becoming more and more self-aware. And I'd like to make some of our participants aware of the materials that already exist for educators. And here I'm speaking of educators even at the primary and secondary level, and I'm going to be illustrating some of them. And of course, the Sufi storytelling tradition is very amenable to that kind of education, not only being imparted passively, telling people these, shall we say, moral and edifying stories, but getting them to create and tell their own stories. And then this sort of humanistic aspect of Sufism, so communicating some of the beauty of Islamic teachings and the Muslim heritage through art, poetry, and music. So in Sufi psychology, and we've had some mentioning of this in the previous presentations, this idea of different levels of the person or different levels of the soul, moving from the lower, more egotistical, commanding or blaming elements of the soul to eventually becoming contented, peaceful, which we learned from Juan's presentation was, essentially a Quranic goal socially, but can begin within. So that ideal level of peace, salam, which is an essential Islamic value, if it's achieved, this idea of inner peace, and then positive peace, sulah or islah, that we heard about. Sufi teachings about the inner jihad, which of course is a basic Islamic teaching, right? That the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that the real struggle is the struggle with the soul. I want to make a pivot here from that theory and the more classical tradition. So don't worry, I know this is a very complicated looking slide, but I want to illustrate for you the sort of movement from classical tradition and perhaps complex teachings about the self and inner transformation. So this is the three levels of the soul from an 18th century Muslim figure, Shah Waliullah, but I want to show you how that's translated into materials that could be used by primary and secondary educators. So there's actually a project of making the works of Al-Ghazali. I had mentioned Al-Ghazali previously as, if you will, a mainstream Muslim thinker who was heavily imbued with a Sufi perspective and wrote multiple volumes. So his work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, its concepts and teachings are being presented or formulated for educating younger people. And I think some of them are not just younger Muslims, but potentially youth in general. So I think some of you who are educators or who are involved in studying that level of education could see the potential here. So it's that sort of complicated teachings of psychology or the self. And here you see the lower self, the real self, that blaming self, and the child is encouraged to self-reflect on their own. So not simply passive education about Sufism, but a kind of more general, psychologically informed a way of generating self-awareness. So here you can see Al-Ghazali kind of friendly, child-friendly teachings. So this idea of polishing your heart, perfecting, cultivating the self. So these are some of the children's activities. And if you like, I can share later how to access some of these resources. So transferring these classical Sufi/Islamic teachings into pedagogical materials for education. And this is the whole series just to show how extensive it is. So this is the classical text, and then the classical text translated for the use of children. So some of this clearly is particularly relevant to Islamic schools or Islamic religious education, but more broadly, some of these materials could be used as part of cultural studies or global ethics. So these are just some of the versions of Rumi's teachings that have been prepared for the younger readers. And this is actually a website of a museum in Australia that has activities for children where, for example, they compose poetry along the lines of Rumi's poetry. So that way of using humanistic or cultural education. So here's yet another example of Rumi stories for young adults. And so all of this material already exists in English that could be adapted. And similar materials do exist in other languages in Muslim majority countries, or in some cases. So you have this issue, okay, you're telling entertaining Rumi stories. Is there also, shall we say, a moral or a religious education implication to some of these stories? So in terms of selectivity, that would have to be considered. Now, this example of a YouTube video, this is actually an anti-bullying teaching, just a couple of minutes that was prepared, taking examples from the life of Prophet Muhammad and putting them into moral or spiritual teachings that would be very accessible to children. One might ask, well, how is this Sufi? Because this, the particular story of Prophet Muhammad being kind to people who were bullying and abusing him, and then the child learns to befriend. So it's actually very resonant with some of the Quranic passages that Juan was presenting to us. And so yes, this is Islamic, and the Sufi element is that these stories about the life of the prophet that illustrate peace and moral edification have been told repeatedly in Muslim society. So yes, that I mean, I think it's a positive point that the line between Sufism or Islamic mysticism and spirituality and whatever else is Islamic is not an absolute firm line, right? It's all can be incorporated into Islamic education. So as I move towards the conclusion of my presentation, I want to flag that Sufism, had very much Islamic mystical teachings, and these moral pedagogies had very much permeated classical Islamic societies. And it's really only in modernity in the 20th century and beyond that you have increasingly, shall we say, a marginalism and a critique of Sufism, a rejection of Sufism, and an excessive, what one might call an excessive privileging of what is Islamic. Islamic, well, we know what that is. It's the law, it's the Sharia. So is Islamic religious education in whatever context, including education about Islam for non-Muslims, is it too much focused on law as being the normative standard? And so you have a number of works, that's why I've illustrated this one. So let's say at the academic level, the discussion of professors, there's a call for sort of, well, let's, a lot of what is Islamic is poetry, art, teachings about love and mortification, teachings that were influenced by Persianate traditions that permeated the cultures of India, Turkey, and even so far as Southeast Asia, that we have to recover some of that and make it part of Islamic education at all levels. Because after all, humanism and the humanities are part of our shared experience, and therefore these provide access at all levels of education for understanding the other and promoting peace. And even in later Sufism, so I have a poem from Muhammad Iqbal, who died in 1938. So this is illustrating shall we say, more recent. So these teachings about the self and self-cultivation, they're also in dialogue with modernity and activism. So this particular poem, which is, of course, very popular in the Urdu language, the gist of which is develop yourself. So this concept of khudi yourself, along with the naf or the nafs or the negative self, there's a kind of positive self, kind of paralleling, negative, negative piece and positive piece. So there's a positive self that the individual can develop to such an extent that their spirituality can be responded to by the divine. So let's say not only the fana or negating the self being annihilated, but internalizing that spirituality so that one can be active and make a positive contribution in the world. So to conclude, some of the potentials of Sufi materials for peace education are that they provide accessible entry points for topic would engage the students in self-reflection, in how they do moral decision making. Also, Sufism should be framed as something that is Islamic. I mean, it doesn't even need to be called Sufism. It can be part of Islamic religious education. So rather than teaching, oh, there's this branch of Islam that are Sufis that are really different. No, this is really central to Islam. And even beyond Islamic religious education, it makes these materials are appealing, let's say, as part of global ethics. So they can be used both in Islamic religious education and in more public school context or more general context, more general curricular elements, for example, in global ethics. So thank you very much for your attention. That's my presentation.